So we have Dr. Richard Helfers. He's an associate professor of criminal justice and public administration at the University of Texas at Tyler. He is a retired police officer, and he's worked in municipal policing for over 25 years. That includes various assignments and roles of responsibility, and retired as rank of captain. His research has primarily focused on police officers' perceptions of their internal and external work environments, and his research has been published in various criminal justice related journals. He earned his PhD in criminology and his MPA from the University of Texas at Dallas, and his bachelor's degree in criminology from Indiana State University. So please help me welcome Dr. Richard Helfers.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate that. It's very formal. I'll say Richard. So I go by Rick, so just refer to me as Rick. I'm not into wasn't when I was a police practitioner, and I'm not as a professor at Tyler. So just please just address me as Rick. That's what I do prefer. Anyway, I'll screw that up probably if I hand this up. I'll go over and just but today I've been asked to come out here, talk to you a little bit about your role as advocates and ethics and how that comes to play. A lot of it is not just me standing up here talking, because you won't get much out of that just listening to me. And so it's more of like those that are on Zoom, wherever Zoom is. When I'm in the classroom, the Zoom's camera's right in front of me, so I point there. But for Zoom also, send in questions. There'll be a few things that you asking y'all to do. Just drop that into the chat so that way we can continue to have a discussion, because ethics is about a discussion, something that has to really occur frequently. When I was a police officer and I was an instructor, I did teach a segment on ethics in our in-service. And those officers would always say, every time that we had it, the licensing group, T-close back then, would say that we have to have this mandated training. But the officers would always come in. You're going to teach us about ethics. You're either ethical or you're not. Well, that's not the point of ethics training and discussion. I will not make you, you're not going to walk out of here and say, now I'm ethical, where it's because y'all are ethical because of being advocates anyways, just walking in here. But it's these discussions and these thoughts that we have on ethics that if we as a society and as groups would have more and more of these discussions, maybe we would make always better decisions. And so it would reflect better upon our thoughts and our actions. And we do a much better job of being able to serve the community and serve our organization that we intend to do. So that's, as it was mentioned, as a police officer for about a little over 25 years. I was fortunate enough to work in a city that had tuition reimbursement. So that's what led me to my second career. Because without the tuition reimbursement, I would not have been able to obtain my graduate degree. So that was it was beneficial for the organization and also beneficial for me as I completed as I tell my students, quarter of a century I was a police officer, and most of them aren't even 25 years old. So that way they think, I guess I'm just ancient. So we'll start out today. Just talk, because we have about an hour and a half, or something like that. So I want to give you just some basic information, and it's thinking and reflecting about who you are and why you do what you do. Y'all are motivated to serve others, to serve the community, and that's why you're here and you're affiliated with CASA. So what I would like you to think about, just take a minute. If you have a notepad or just in your own mind, those that are on Zoom, as you're thinking about it, just drop it into the chat. You think about your values. What are one or two of your values? What are the values that you have? That's when we start thinking about ethics. We have to know who we are and reflect upon that on a daily basis. So take a minute or so and think about your values. Is there anybody that would like to venture out there and say what you value? What do you value?
Honesty.
Honesty. Others.
Authenticity.
Authenticity.
Respect.
Respect.
Treating your neighbor as you want to be treated.
Treat as you would want to be treated, like the golden rule.
Helping others through my actions and words.
Yeah, helping others. His actions. Yeah, because actions often speak louder.
We had one person in Zoom who said integrity.
Integrity. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, thinking about the golden rule, a lot of times I flip that in ethics courses that I have, and I said, think about the silver rule. Have you all heard about the silver rule? Oftentimes people say that they haven't heard about it. It's kind of just almost a mirror opposite, which is do not do unto others as you would not have done to you. And some people start thinking about that, but say, oh, that's even more powerful than just to do the stuff, but don't do to others. And so, because it really comes down to our actions and our behaviors. When we think about it. Was there any others in that?
Loyalty.
Loyalty are great ones. And so, like in a semester-long class, I would have students think about this as be a longer exercise, and it's things that they would bring back into the conversation to ensure that it's things that are just not compartmentalized, day in and day out. Think about ethics; it has to be the totality of the entire semester, of the entire year, the entire lives as we think about it. How do we become more ethical and think about that? And it has to be at the forefront of our minds. And as an advocate at CASA, what are some of the things when you're thinking, besides just your own individual values, think about CASA? What does CASA stand for and the values that CASA has? It's empathy at its core. Empathy, yeah. Yeah. Empathy, ensuring there's fairness, right? Somebody to be able to protect others, especially those that are some of the most vulnerable, children. Yeah.
Courage.
Courage, yeah.
Consistency.
So I have the next point up there, the importance of ethics for you. So how important is ethics for you as an advocate in your role at CASA?
I would say very important. It's almost like we need to be above reproach because we have little ones looking up to us, but as well as the people we work with.
Yeah. Yeah. How important do you think ethics should be for others in society? And then
More than it is.
more than it is. Yeah. We hear quite a bit about the deterioration of the American society, right? And what gets valued and not valued. What are those conversations? What are those words that we hear out in public? The actions that people take in public today that they may not have done 10, 20, 30 years ago. As society changed, as individuals' thoughts change, and the standards in our society changed. So things are constantly evolving, and we as individuals that are serving the community, we have to think about that stuff too, evolve also. But that's where it goes back to those values and really know, if you really been, like I just threw that out there, but after today, this evening, this weekend, sometimes really be thinking about your values and how those align to ensure that your thoughts and your actions are going to align with your values and then the values of CASA, and what CASA stands for. When I was in the classroom, I always have these students that are coming up to me, asking about various jobs that are coming, that they may be interested in. And the first thing I ask them, regardless of what type of organization they're looking for, whether it's in a police organization, probation department, a juvenile department, going out to law school, wherever it may be, I ask them, I says, what do you value? Now, when you go out and look for that other job, that profession that you want to spend your life in, what does that organization value? Because if your values and the organizational values conflict, you're going to have a lot of conflict in your life. You won't be happy. So ensure that you find out as much as you can about those organizations, ensure that you get into the organization that aligns with your values, because otherwise you'll have problems and you'll have unhappiness, and that's not what we want to have with with our lives. And I think some of that comes into play in regards to unethical behavior that we see. And you may see some of it also as an advocate because you are interacting with those in the criminal justice field, correct? You're dealing with CPS, you're dealing with police officers, you're dealing with judges and attorneys, so you can see what's going on. So where does that put you? Is it a very comfortable situation that you have, or an uncomfortable situation? Can you always say when things are not aligning correctly for the kids or not? How do you resolve that? Sometimes just resolving it in your own mind and then passing along to the staff here. But it could create inner turmoil, couldn't it? Dealing with ethics, I think, does create turmoil because of what we see, what we experience with others in your role as an advocate, in my role as a professor, seeing what goes on with students, as my role that I had previously working for a police organization. It's just, there can be a lot of turmoil there. If you're being very ethical and you're thinking about it all the time and you're questioning and you're thinking about ways that you can improve upon that, it does create a little bit of stress. But it's to be able to now to kind of understand some of these things too. And that's where I put up just these ethical thinking. These are some fancy words that philosophers came up with many years ago, like teleological ethics, deontological ethics. Have y'all ever heard about that? Some of you have, some of you haven't. And if you haven't, you probably won't even think about these words again after we get done today. But there's different ways in which this comes into play, and you may recognize it in specific people that you are that you have experience with and in your role. So teleological ethics is just simply looking at the outcome. What is the end of it? And in criminal justice, as it was becoming a discipline of its own back in the 70s, there was a very popular Hollywood series that was kind of happening in the 70s and 80s with Clint Eastwood. It was called Dirty Harry. You all seen any Dirty Harry movies? And when we talk about teleological ethics in an academic sense, we talk about the Dirty Harry syndrome. I understand it, but my 20-year-old students sit there and say, who? What? So I have to kind of explain what it is, and that's, I direct them towards the movies, which is basically what Inspector Callahan, Dirty Harry, cares about is getting the bad guy, getting the ends. You know, as long as the bad guy gets thrown in jail, he's happy. However, it doesn't do any benefits for the criminal justice system because he doesn't pay attention to the way he goes about it and violates these individuals' rights. So they get off and they're out walking the streets. And is that what police officers, in the sense of Dirty Harry, should be valuing? Yeah, getting the bad guy is important, but there's also that sense of justice and fairness that becomes very important. So that's a lot of it also. And part of teleological ethics is really embedded within the criminal justice system, which is another fancy word, utilitarianism, which is just the greatest good for the greatest number. That's what the criminal justice system exists for. That's what our government and laws will want to do, is that they find out what is the greatest good for the largest number. That's where they determine where that punishment is that occurs also. And part of your role as advocate is trying to figure out overall, you're advocating for the child, but it's also part of that criminal justice system to understand what is the greatest thing that can happen. What's the best outcome here? What's the best thing that can happen in your role as the advocate? So that becomes very important. And on the other side of ethics, ethical thinking, teleological, which is the ends, but then there's the ontological, which is talking about the means. And that's where Dirty Harry misses the point, is because he doesn't care about really what his duty is. And the duty is getting the end of the arrest, but you need to be able to get a conviction. If somebody's doing something wrong, they need to be held responsible. And so it's winds up being your duty. It's the means that we look at. Has anybody ever heard of Aristotle? Probably everybody's heard of Aristotle, right? From an ethical and applied ethics point of view, I think he is very, very powerful. And especially when we look at the ethics of virtue. And this probably has more, the other ones, okay, it's the ends, it's the means, but it's really this being more virtuous. And he talked about living the good life. But we never really get to that good life. We want to try to get to that good life, but it is moving just a little bit every day that we get to that point. And how do we do that? You have any ideas how we do that? How do we become better almost every day, every week, every year? We learn, and the way we do that, what Aristotle would talk about is that we want to take a step back, and if every day, ideally, if we can just reflect. If we can reflect upon our own thoughts. There's I read a book recently. It's a leadership book. It has to do with ethics. Leadership and ethics should come together. Don't look to individuals as leaders just because they have some sort of title. That doesn't make somebody a leader. But all of you are leaders by being volunteers, being advocates. Guy's name is Dave Anderson. He's actually from Tyler. Went to West Point. Spent some time. His father also co-wrote the book with him. They do a lot of speaking and training on it, but they focus upon character. And their whole idea is focusing upon it's really 6 character traits. The primary ones would be duty and humility. And within duty, you have integrity. A lot of people are talking about integrity and honesty. So it's courage, and that's where integrity comes, and duty, the sense of duty. We talked about that with theological ethics. The other side of that is humility, the positivity, and also selflessness. Just think if more people were selflessness. We're in an election cycle right now. Are we going to see selflessness or selfishness? That's probably something to kind of pay attention to make sure that the right individuals are being elected to represent us. So can't neglect the whole idea of politics in your role as an advocate. Because that becomes very important, because those policy decisions that are made, those laws that are made, those trickle down. And public administration, we always talk about that key phrase, unintended consequences. Whenever a law or a policy is put into place, there's an unintended consequence. And who deals with those unintended consequences? I would think all of you in your role. And that's where that ethical conflict can come in. Next question I have. What are your ideas about the law and ethics? You have to have laws, you have to have ethics, and you go together.
But obviously, at some points, ethics are in conflict with the law.
Mhm.
At some point, we can just look back at the civil rights era. There were laws that separated races, and that was in conflict with many people's ethics, and so the laws had to be changed.
Yeah, because we evolve, our thinking evolves. The laws change, court decisions are made, appellate court decisions change, Supreme Court decisions change to align more with where we're thinking as a country. And Supreme Court is usually very cognizant of public opinion. Sometimes they make mistakes, sometimes they change their mistakes, sometimes, there's things that have happened over, the last 200 and almost 50 years that we've seen those changes are there. But yeah, so when we think about the law, think about ethics, both of them have to come into play. So think about the law as being the ground floor in anybody's ethical thinking. Somebody breaks the law, which depends what type it is. There's always discretion that's involved in other circumstances, but we think that if you abide by the law, you don't break the law, you're ethical. So that's a good first step to being an ethical person. However, to even become more ethical, to do a better job, to get to that ideal of the good life, we have to be well above that. Not just because we don't break the law, but because that we go much further in advance of that, to ensure that we are being those representatives that everybody looks towards. And I think that winds up being very important, because a lot of people will just say, well, I didn't get arrested, I didn't break the law, so my behavior was acceptable. Maybe, maybe not. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Just because, it could be it wouldn't be a law violation, but maybe you take that silver route and you don't do the things. So this whole thing is a very cloudy, vague concept when we talk about ethics. It's not something that's easy for that. The character, or the pillars of character. There's 6 pillars of character that have been out there. Have y'all heard about those before? You know what they are? I know my students in my undergraduate ethics class, they've heard them, and I bet you they probably know about them today. Because I gave them a quick little assessment yesterday in class and said, just list them out for me. I said, we've talked about them for the last couple of weeks since the semester began. Just write them out. Some did, some got a few of them, and some said, almost, what are you talking about? So the things that are the pillars of character are important for ethics to be thinking about as you continue in your role as an advocate, is to be thinking about, we talked about values, but maybe you take these as being what's valuable and become these pillars, which would be, I always go by them in alphabetical order. That's what I tell my students. Go by in alphabetical order is going to be a lot easier. So it's caring. Already sounds like y'all fit the role here. Caring. There's citizenship. Giving back to your community. You're doing something that's much bigger than yourself by being a volunteer. There's fairness. There's respect. There's responsibility. There's trustworthiness. Trustworthy. How does that all fit into your own mold, your own mindset as you embrace the role as an advocate? Does it align with it? Does it not align? Are there parts that do, parts that don't? Those things to think about. Does anybody on Zoom have any questions up to this point, or just how would these characters, as you would think about it, help you in your role as the advocate? Are these pillars something that you think about? Have thought about in one way? Didn't have to be directly thinking about it. Have you ever thought about that? Something to think about. So I put this as representation. When we think about ethics and thoughts. Let me back up a moment. I talked about like Anderson and what he was referring to, how you get to that point of being more ethical. Being a lead, he talks about leader of character. I refer to my takeaway from his dad's writing is being more ethical, because his writing is very much aligned with Aristotle in the sense that we have thoughts. Becoming a person of character, because you find you run into a lot of individuals that be challenged with some areas of character. Out in public, just think about that. Even the next couple of days, you think about this out in public, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, where individuals' values are in their character. Because how you become an individual of high character, ethical, or having a more ethical everyday life, you have to reflect upon your thoughts. It all starts with your thoughts. We all have thoughts, right? And then those thoughts become words. And we speak about stuff, right? With maybe ourselves. Y'all speak to yourself. Do you answer yourself? You like to. So I have really great conversations with my dog too. Yeah. He's the best listener, that's right. So it starts with our thoughts, it goes to our words, and then our words can become our actions, right? Our behavior. And then if we repeat this and we're not reflecting on, there could be a situation that we could have done a better job just with our thoughts. Why was I thinking that certain way? I should change the way that I'm something because it's not very ethical, or saying something or acting upon it. But then if we don't question ourselves and reflect upon what we're doing and saying to make sure it's aligning with our values, then we do that behavior repetitive. Then as Anderson talks about, he says, then it becomes a habit. And those habits define our character. And think about that as, it doesn't have to be within your role as an advocate, but you can apply it to that, your role as an advocate. In the sense of, who do you see? What do they say? You're not gonna know what they think, but you can know what they're thinking is by what they're talking about. And then also by their actions. And is it repetitive? And is it something that should be addressed? Then you get into the whole, idea of, calling somebody out or being a whistleblower on somebody. Whistleblower can be in various degrees. But that's challenging. You call somebody out, else out. That takes quite a bit of character, quite a bit of courage. It's not always easy, especially if it's somebody in some level of authority. And when you're talking about levels of authority in the criminal justice system, you're dealing with a lot of people with various levels of authority and power, right? Yeah. How does that then turn in and play on you? So those are things just to be thinking. Like I'm saying, I'm just throwing stuff out for you to be thinking about, because that's what ethics is about. As I mentioned, I know there's a few people that showed up maybe a little bit later after we had started on Zoom, is that we're not walking out of here and all of a sudden now we're a much better ethical person. These are all thinking points, talking points, having conversations with yourself. That's how you reflect, having a conversation really with yourself and then others, and figuring out how is it that you can improve upon your own thinking and words and actions. But even with all this, and this is the kind of the issue that I run into, is that I teach some ethics courses, and I'm here talking to you about ethics. That does not mean that I am the expert on it. It means that I have some knowledge on it, but then when there are students, they kind of think, oh, you're teaching it, so you have to be this perfect person, the most ethical person that's out there. We are all going to fall down on our ethical responsibilities. Not every day, hopefully not every day, and hopefully only a little bit sometimes, but that's what this whole reflection idea is about. To think about these concepts and these terms and these phrases, so that way we think about what we are thinking, what we are speaking, what we are doing, so that way we improve upon it. So that way, every day or every week, we're making just a little step further in our own ethical evolution to ensure that we are centered, and we are centered with our values, and we know where we stand. We've all heard about the ethical compass, right? Are some individuals' ethical compass off kilter somewhere, right? Not pointing due north. Yeah. Have you seen that movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks? They've lost control, and they need to find a way in which to get back to Earth. So he's got that little instrument template out the window, looking at the moon because he needs a fixed object. And as they, push the blaster to get energy moving, the moon's bouncing around there in that little window. That's what I think of with ethics. Ethics, a lot of times there's things that are happening, things are bouncing around, but we have to stay centered, and we have to keep that moon in the window for us. Where is our center? It's not as easy talking like I talk in classes or I talk up here. It's easy to say from a theoretical aspect how ethics is and what we should do, but it's different. So if that little imagery helps you, that's the way I see ethics being. It's always bouncing around. So who do we represent with our behavior? I have it up here. That's me, I represent myself. You represent yourself. You represent your family, your friends, your social network. When you are acting in the role as an advocate, you are representing CASA. When I was a police officer, when I was, whether I was on duty or off duty, I was representing the police organization I was working for. Just as you represent CASA. So, with thinking about that, take a moment, throw the idea into the chat, write something down, throw it out here. What does the community expect from you? As an advocate, what do you think that the community expects from you? Oh, what's that?
Leadership.
Leadership? Anything else?
Not yet in the chat. I think for me though, questions like this always like bring up this like internal feeling of like one answer, but on the other hand, another answer. So I feel like sometimes the community would expect us to have grace in some circumstances, but also be much more stern in other circumstances. So it's almost kind of like a spectrum.
Yeah.
But on the chat, we did get somebody that said transparency, to uphold the mission and vision of the organization, and knowledge of someone's role and showing up. Yeah, that's good. Upholding the mission and values. I was going to talk about that later, but it was brought up here. That's good. You need to know what the mission is. What are the values? If you have your own mission statement, your own personal mission statement, it's something to think about. If you don't, it could be one for your entire life, your personal life and your professional life, being an advocate, or it could be one specifically as being an advocate, one just for yourself personally. And then how do you know that you're achieving that? What in terms of what are the values again that you have that feed into that mission? To know who you are. So part of ethics is thinking about knowing who you are and knowing what the organization is, what they stand for in order to achieve that. People that may not have goals, ideas of what they want to accomplish in life, they may struggle with finding that direction, what they want to do. It's all part of ethics. Ethics is more than just, right or wrong behavior, about doing good or not doing good. There's so much that's involved in that. But you always have to think about this representation of who you have with yourself, your family, your organization itself. There's things we think of that don't seem to play out too well when we watch the news or social media. There's so much that's out there, and we're so quick to point fingers, right? We as a society, not we as this individual group, about people that do wrong. But do we really understand what's going on? I see these phrases every once in a while, these memes that show up, have kindness, be nice to people, because you just don't know what that other person is going through, rather than passing judgments. Are there a lot of people that pass judgments? Criminal justice system and actors within the criminal justice system, that's pretty much their job, right? Especially like judges, right? Police officers have to make a determination. They gather the facts, not probable cause. They make the arrest and it goes to the process through trial, but they're making a judgment. We all make judgments every day.
But then it goes back to, what are we thinking? What are we speaking? What are our actions that we go through? And are we reflecting upon that? This determines whether or not we're making a good determination. Do you have any examples of, in your role as an advocate, of could have been questionable behavior without naming names, but just generalize the situation? Are there unethical ideas, unethical thoughts, actions that occurred that have been troubling to the volunteers?
I've had kids sent home before I felt like it was time, before I felt like the parents had done everything they needed to.
Of course, sometimes we're looking at that totally different because we're looking at the children and what's best for them. And others that are on the team are looking at their caseloads and the parents and all of that. And so it doesn't always, it conflicts. It doesn't always feel the same, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. Caseloads have to be a big hindrance for individuals, or what influences those decisions too. And of course, there's organizationally, can't negate the fact that there's political pressures within an organization, not the politics we know about the running for office, just the internal politics of a organization, of what to do and how to go about it and doing it. Yeah, and that's challenging for like the CPS workers, the social workers that are involved with a lot of the children. Yeah, what can you do when maybe they think that they know that there's more that they can do, but there's just nothing they can do or believe they should do at that point based upon the parameters that are provided by the system. There's quite a
We
bit
have
that
something in the chat along the lines of CPS's speed not moving in the same amount of speed or quickness that we would like to.
Yeah. Yeah, CPS, they, just thinking about what they have to do, their caseloads and their turnover they have with workers and the news articles that come out and news stories that come out. Yeah, that's a very stressful job. That's a whole case study in itself on ethics in regards to CPS, but and it's just not just like the CPS. In other lines of work or just as things progress, we think about, man, if everything just worked on my timeline, right? Why don't people just do things the way I want it done? But then that's being, as I talk about, one of those issues with humility, that's being selfish. And it's also like that meme that I was talking about, we don't know what other people are going through. It's just that we have to try to just be more open-minded, objective, and thinking about it is just, what is it that we can do ethically? And also, it's not for us then as volunteers to hold it in, is to talk to other staff. What is the best way in which to handle it? How can I resolve this internal conflict also? Because what you're doing is so, and we're very fortunate to have the advocates that are out there. But yeah, it's definitely an ethical issue that surfaces. Not knowing that you can get things done and believing that it could go quicker. And there's just so many constraints on our lives in organizations, on processing. When we start talking about the bureaucracy involved with courts itself, it's just difficult, I think, is the best way in which to put that. And that's the thing about ethics, is that there's no clear, easy answers on how to resolve these things. And it's for us just to constantly be thinking about this and reflecting and knowing that you are doing what is the best thing for that child. And that's all that we can ask of ourselves, and you can ask of yourself also on it. The next thing I put on is the ease of ethics. We've touched on this because it's hard not to touch upon the ease of ethics, right? Ethics is easy. If ethics was easy, everybody would do it, right? We'd have this utopian society, perfect society, where nothing went wrong. And then we wouldn't need a criminal justice system, because all parents would be great. All people would be great. And there would be no offending whatsoever. But there is. So I talk about the ease of ethics, and the whole idea about that is, how easy is it to think, speak, and act ethically? It's not easy.
Right. Sometimes it's very difficult to act as towards the people that you deal with, and assuming whether they're ethical and trusted. It's really hard to walk that fine line.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I know others have used this, but I first remember in a biography of Ronald Reagan that I read several years ago, in regards to his foreign policy. It was trust but verify, had to do with the Cold War and everything. So I'll trust you, but I'm still going to verify it, right? Yeah. So that may not be a bad phrase to think of in your line of being an advocate. Yeah, I'm going to trust you. I have no reason not to, but I still need to verify what's going on, because you talk about how easy it is to think, speak, and act ethically. We can talk about this, and if we don't keep it at the forefront of our minds and think about the what ifs that happen out there, we fall back. We're human. I'm human. I talk about this to my students all the time. I said, we talk about it, and that's the whole idea of this reflection. But if I don't keep it at the forefront of my mind, it's easy for me to take a step back, gossip about somebody else, talk about somebody else here or there, or they should have done this or that, without just confronting them and asking them what was going on. If I have a problem, so I should be asking. No reason to talk to somebody else, but you want to keep that in the front of your mind, but always make sure that we're doing the right thing. It's not easy. So next thing I had up there is, what are the influences when things go awry? Whether it's in your role as an advocate, in your role as a friend, or a parent, a brother, a sister, things we see in society. What influences these things? What are the influences?
The way I look at it is, competing priorities. We're focused singularly on the best interests of the child, but not everyone has those same priorities. It doesn't mean that they're not trying to act selflessly, but they have practical things. It's just like I used to be a claims adjuster for years, and so I had to make happy my boss, but I also had to make happy customers. So I was caught in between. I was trying to act in the best interest of everybody.
Yeah.
But from the outside, it may look like, well, you're not pursuing a balanced perspective, but you're just trying to balance multiple priorities. So that's kind of the reality that gets in the way of ethical behavior in terms of the outward appearance. That's why I look at it.
Yeah. And you're trying to do what's best for everybody. It goes back to that utilitarian perspective. What's the best thing for the greatest number of people? But it's hard. You're caught in the middle. We don't know everything that's going on, but we want to advocate for the child, and that's the role, is to advocate for the child. Because if you're not there advocating, who is? Otherwise, then these other entities, the other positions, would get their way. So it's very important for you to be advocating for that child, to say what you believe is in their best interest. and do it ethically. At the end of the day, the decisions are made by others. And we just have to recognize that. And these, when I look at these influences, there's many influences that impact it. And whether we're looking at something on the news, something that happens in your role as the advocate, you know, there, and you see there's maybe something that's maybe unethical that had happened. You know, who's to blame? Think about what we see on social media and the news. The police are always the easy target because they're the most visible aspect of the criminal justice system. What happens with the little clip that we see? A quick pointing of the finger, right? It's that individual. Even from the organization, right? Leaders saying, oh, it's this officer, that officer. You've heard that phrase before? If you're pointing at somebody, there's three pointing back at you. So those are things to think about when we see something that's happening in our role, whether it's out in society or as an advocate, is that there's other things to look at. Yes, there could be individual responsibility. And if somebody did something wrong, there needs to be individual accountability. But we hear that sometimes there's these individuals that just have gone outside the bounds of the organization they shouldn't have done. Well, it could be the situation itself. So you have the individual, you have a situation we have to consider, but then there's a big one that's really never discussed in these ethical situations when there's things that go awry. These are these big things that we've been talking about, but it applies to your role and the things that you see as the organization, the system. So maybe taking it to, a policing context, it's not just the officers. Why is it the same departments over and over are having these issues that we see? There's so many organizations that are out there, we don't see that routinely. But maybe it is more of an organizational aspect too. So you can't neglect the organizational aspect. There's a situational aspect, there's the individual aspect, and we want to make sure that there is accountability there. Oftentimes it's easier just to point fingers at the individual. But in your role, always consider that when something's happening and maybe something is causing some internal turmoil, that it's not just that individual. So we want to recognize the fact it could be something, pressures coming down through the organization, or maybe there's something that's not right within the organization that's causing it. And that's not your role to fix it or anything, but just to be aware of it. And if you feel compelled to talk to somebody that's in more of a line of authority, then you can do so on that. But then there's also this conflict, and you want to take that on or not, and how do you resolve that conflict? One of the last things before we wrap up here is a lot of ethical things involve a moral dilemma. And as you all have mentioned, what you're talking about are moral dilemmas, where you have yourselves, you're the moral agent that's out there, and then there's something else that does happen. There's implications, oftentimes for the child in your role, or some other entity that's out there. And then there's also a time that you just mentioned, there's likely to be some sort of harm that occurs. And then with this conflict, I was here, resolve this conflict, is that emotions get involved. And people are going to feel some sense of guilt or remorse because of it. There's a very classic example that I have here is a moral dilemma that you may have seen before. You probably have seen it. But just think about this once again, and then you can just write down or think about, put in the chat, how you would resolve it. It's what's called that trolley car problem. You can just read basically very quickly what I have up there, what the trolley car problem is. And then think about what you would do. So the question is, would you pull that lever leading to one death, but saving 5? What would you do?
I'd like to think that I'd be pragmatic about that situation, save the 5, but I can also see myself freezing and doing nothing. Not intentionally, but just from an emotional reaction. And the good thing that would come out of that, your inaction, would be I had no part in what played out. So I'd be basically separating myself from what happened.
Yeah.
So it's tough to tell.
What else?
I think it's so fast, I couldn't tell you what I would do, but I think I would.
It's similar to a situation like in triage with mass casualties. You have to
Yeah.
save the people that you can save, and it's gonna end up being, you know, you're gonna have to forsake somebody on that.
Yeah, this leads to is anything in the chat how you would respond, something that's different, and always remember, when we talk about decisions, no decision, especially if it's a conscious no decision, is a decision. But do we know how we would respond? These are the type of, maybe not something as drastic like this, but you're always thinking about, from your experience as an advocate, what are the likely type of scenarios that could happen? So you start thinking about this stuff in advance. What if happens? When I was a police officer, it was always, okay, you're walking up to a car. What if this happens? What if, instead of just walking up, this is gonna happen. You don't know. If you're not prepared, then the worst thing can happen. But if you're thinking about the what ifs, you're already trying to be one step ahead. And that's part of ethics. And there's another take on this. I got a video on here. If the video is going to work, or do you want to just take it down and just bring it up from YouTube?
Chat, we had one person weighing the odds, save 5, and hope the one gets out.
Yeah, there's no clear answer to it. I just don't know. Okay. There you go. Just press play. For those on Zoom, will be able to hear us.
Imagine you're watching a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks straight towards 5 workers who can't escape. You happen to be standing next to a switch that will divert the trolley onto a second track. Here's the problem. That track has a worker on it too, but just one. What do? Do you sacrifice one person to save 5? This is the trolley problem, a version of an ethical dilemma that philosopher Philippa Foot devised in 1967. It's popular because it forces us to think about how to choose when there are no good choices. Do we pick the action with the best outcome, or stick to a moral code that prohibits causing someone's death? In one survey, about 90% of respondents said that it's okay to flip the switch, letting one worker die to save 5. And other studies, including a virtual reality simulation of the dilemma, have found similar results. These judgments are consistent with the philosophical principle of utilitarianism, which argues that the morally correct decision is the one that maximizes well-being for the greatest number of people. The 5 lives outweigh 1, even if achieving that outcome requires condemning someone to death. But people don't always take the utilitarian view, which we can see by changing the trolley problem a bit. This time, you're standing on a bridge over the track as the runaway trolley approaches. Now there's no second track, but there is a very large man on the bridge next to you. If you push him over, his body will stop the trolley, saving the 5 workers, but he'll die. To utilitarians, the decision is exactly the same. Lose 1 life to save 5. But in this case, only about 10% of people say that it's okay to throw the man onto the tracks. Our instincts tell us that deliberately causing someone's death is different than allowing them to die. die as collateral damage. It just feels wrong for reasons that are hard to explain. This intersection between ethics and psychology is what's so interesting about the trolley problem. The dilemma and its many variations reveal that what we think is right or wrong depends on factors other than a logical weighing of the pros and cons. For example, men are more likely than women to say it's okay to push the man over the bridge. So are people who watch a comedy clip before doing the thought experiment. And in one virtual reality study, people were more willing to sacrifice men than women. Researchers have studied the brain activity of people thinking through the classic and bridge versions. Both scenarios activate areas of the brain involved in conscious decision-making and emotional responses. But in the bridge version, the emotional response is much stronger. So is activity in an area of the brain associated with processing internal conflict. Why the difference? One explanation is that pushing someone to their death feels more personal, activating an emotional aversion to killing another person. But we feel conflicted because we know it's still the logical choice. Trolleyology has been criticized by some philosophers and psychologists. They argue that it doesn't reveal anything because its premise is so unrealistic that study participants don't take it seriously. But new technology is making this kind of ethical analysis more important than ever. For example, driverless cars may have to handle choices like causing a small accident to prevent a larger one. Meanwhile, governments are researching autonomous military drones that could wind up making decisions of whether they'll risk civilian casualties to attack a high-value target. If we want these actions to be ethical, we have to decide, in advance, how to value human life and judge the greater good. So researchers who study autonomous systems are collaborating with philosophers to address the complex problem of programming ethics into machines. Which goes to show that even hypothetical dilemmas can wind up on a collision course with the real world.
So does that change it? Change your perspective by watching that little animation of the trolley? When I first saw that, I said, so you have a large man, they say, up there. And is that large man just gonna stand there and allow push over? So I read too much into some things, I guess.
Well, I think it's just, that's what I was thinking about the man. It's too personal then. And then I freeze. I may know it's the same situation, but it's personal if you're looking at someone rather than being on down the track. It's just totally, in my mind, becomes a different choice.
And I think that provides more value to this little exercise than just the word they're up and have a little discussion, because even in a mention is that most people say, no, you're not going to do that. And then that's really where the rubber meets the road for you as advocates. When you have these ethical situations out there, it's you. And decisions that are being made, you know, what is it that you have to talk about? What is it that you have to do? You know, everyone's always going to say, oh, you should do 1, 2, and 3, but do they really know? Somebody had mentioned, and the previous one was, we don't really know. Do we really know how we're going to act until we're in that situation?
I immediately thought of the Uvalde case, that, you know, those officers were trained to go in, which should be their instinct, but they didn't know until they faced that their instinct wasn't to go.
Yeah.
Theirs was to do nothing. And that's a really big example.
Yeah.
They probably would have said, oh, I'd go before it
Because
actually happened.
they had training, right?
Yes.
We know that from the report that was come out, and it's, yeah, you have training, but if you don't ever really think about the what if in reality, then you may not be prepared. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here with my little quick talk about ethics and being the ethical advocate, is to
Did anyone ever think about throwing theirself off instead of?
I did, I was just thinking, like, I think I'm large enough to stop the trolley.
I mean, in some instances, people that are in law enforcement and everything else, they have to make that decision. Sometimes it's,
I feel
I
like
put myself out there to protect somebody.
Just curious.
Well, what if the one is someone you know, then that even
Yeah,
changes the
exactly.
situation.
Yeah, it becomes personal, not just personally pushing off, but if it's somebody that you know, that you may see out there too.
Yeah.
Then that changes the whole dynamics. That goes back to.
Yeah.
People always pointing fingers and really not understanding the entire situation.
I was thinking about situations that we might have to go through while being an advocate. And I thought about a removal, recommending a removal. I think it's not as dramatic as someone dying or 5 people dying, but it is abuse for the children. So it can be either, being part of the decision to cause the child more trauma or leave them in a situation of where there might be potential abuse. Or making a hotline call if you don't know if it's if there's abuse happening, but you have to make the call that might cause, the child to undergo trauma. So I think it's those forks in the road.
And that may be a good way, as we're ending here today, just thinking about follow-up and ethical discussions. And then the next part is, what are some, maybe these are just generalized type of scenarios that we as a group work through and discuss to help you prepare, so you're not confronted with the trolley problem at that time. You're much better prepared of how or what's the best way in which to address these ethical issues that you have, the real life ethical issues. So this could be looked at as more as a foundation part of it, but then get into really the nuts and bolts of it is having discussions. That's where ethics really comes into play. If it's just a one-time deal, just like when I was a police trainer, is a one-time deal. You only have it every year or every other year because the state licensing requires it. People kind of, oh, okay, I'm a prisoner basically listening to it. But if it becomes part of the daily, weekly routine, that's kind of what we had trained to ensure that it became part of the discussion. So the mission and value statement of the organization became part of those discussions when we had briefings, when we had individual officer inspections. That's not just a one-time deal. It has to be routine, but having scenarios that are specific for advocates, which would be confronting, maybe a good next step to further the ethical discussion in your workshops. So my takeaways here that I have for you is that think and reflect. Is that I want you to be able to that's what ethics is about for me, and what that I've really learned over the years of reading more and more ethical articles and attending ethical seminars, is that it's about reflecting and just trying to turn our own individual dial just a little bit and to be thinking about it. So we have to know our values. Think about those pillars of character that we had talked about, and how does that align with your role? So, justifying behavior, but does it relieve responsibility? We can justify, we can understand if, we're talking about if it's there's an individual, a situation, the organization, realize that the organization maybe has some role in it. That doesn't alleviate that individual responsibility, because the individual is making that decision to act. We have free will. We have that ability to think for our own. We have to understand our values and don't deviate from those. And we also don't want to make any sort of rush to judgment. When we see unethical behavior occurring, whether it's something on the news or something within your role, just not a quick rush to judgment. We don't know all the facts about that. So we need to really reflect upon that and find out more information if we're in that role as a decision maker to have some impacts on that. Otherwise, it's just being empathetic and support. So always think about individual, situational, and organizational aspects of whatever behavior that may have occurred that has caused it. So is there anything else that maybe I have left out? Here's questions, what did I leave out? Is there anything that you'd still like to discuss? And then I left my contact information there with my email. Feel free to send me an email if there's something that we talked about that you want to discuss further, or something that you don't agree with, or just want to chat. Just give me a call. We could set something up. I hope at least some of the information was valuable for you as you think about your role, and thank you for being a resident of Smith County. Thank you for what you do as volunteers. We do appreciate that. Thank you. If there's any other questions? Any questions on Zoom?
No, sir. Yeah, no, not yet. But please, if you're, attending via Zoom, drop something in the chat if you have a question.
It's all intended just to make you think.
Yeah.
What this information is, just to think a little bit more about it.
We did have one person who mentioned earlier that if they were an observer of the trolley car situation, they felt as if, since they're not trained to be, employed, I guess, by the railroad, that they wouldn't feel comfortable pulling the lever. And so I thought that was a really good point, just because, a lot of what we do involves, training, knowing roles and everything. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point too. If you're not comfortable doing, don't know how to do it, you could make a situation worse.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, thanks for providing your contact information on there. So I'm sure somebody, if there's anybody else that has a question, please use that contact information. If you felt that this was applicable to your advocacy, please drop a 1 to 5 rating in the chat. So that way we know that information is very helpful to us.